Today in this video we'll talk about the passive immunity and active immunity. So this tabulation I have taken it from the USMLE Step 1 First Aid book. So we are discussing the passive and active immunity under the heading of the mechanism of acquisition, onset, duration. We'll talk about various examples and we'll talk about short notes about the passive and active immunity. The mechanism of acquisition of the passive immunity is quite simple. The passive immunity is acquired by receiving the preformed antibodies. The preformed antibodies that we make in our laboratory are injected in our body or acquired in our body through the various means. It can be given by the injection or other various route of inhalation or route of acquisition. So the preformed antibodies that has been already made in the lab, so after receiving those antibodies we get the passive immunity, whereas the active immunity, there is the exposure to exogenous antigen. So after exposing to the exogenous antigen, our body itself make the antibodies against that antigen, so that is an active immunity. So the onset of passive immunity is quite rapid, but the onset of the active immunity is slow, because in the passive immunity the antibodies are acquired, received quickly, and those antibodies actively acts in our body. But whereas in the active immunity, after the exposure to antigen, it takes quite a time for our body to make the antibodies against that antigen. So the onset of action of the active immunity is quite slower than the passive immunity. The duration of the passive immunity is short because the lifespan of the antibodies are very less. Probably the half-life of the antibodies could be of 3 weeks. So the booster could be needed in the passive immunity. But if we talk about the active immunity, it has the long-lasting immunity. The long-lasting protection of the active immunity is conferred by the mechanism called as memory. Whenever we are exposed to certain exogenous antigen, our body makes the antibodies against that antigen, and how the antigen makes our body weak and the antibodies are created against them. So certain memory is withheld in our body. So again, if there is repeated exposure to that antigen, our body is able to make the antibodies against that antigen time and time in the active immunity, but it is not possible in the passive immunity. If we talk about the examples of the passive immunity, those are the immunoglobulin A in the breast milk, the maternal immunoglobulin G crossing the placenta, the antitoxin, the humanized monoclonal antibodies are some example of the passive immunity. Whereas in the active immunity, the natural infection, the vaccines, and the toxoids are the examples of the active immunity in our body. Now let's talk about short notes about the passive and active immunity. So in the passive immunity, after the exposure to tetanus toxin or hepatitis B virus, varicella, rabies virus, or botulinum toxin or diphtheria toxin, the unvaccinated patient are given preformed antibodies, that is the passive immunity, so that the infection does not spread rapidly. Whereas the active immunity is the combined passive and active immunization can be given for the hepatitis B or rabies exposure patients. So in this video, we have talked about the differentiation between the passive and active immunity. I hope you understood this lecture. Thank you.